All right. So to echo Chief Heppel, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here this evening. It's great to see the community have so much energy and interest in how we move forward together. And so right off the bat, I put lots of logos right here on my first slide because it is a true community effort. It's not one agency, it's not one neighborhood. It's all of us working together. And we've gotten a lot of calls and a lot of questions and a lot of concern following the holiday farm fire about could that happen here in Eugene, specifically thinking about our South Hills and the fuel that we have up there, the trees, some of the steep terrain, the beauty that we have up there, certainly our biggest wildland interface area. So I'm going to start out by giving a quick overview of what we are doing as the city, some of our partnering agencies. We're going to spend most of our time talking about what you can do if you live in those interface areas and how we can better coordinate to maximize our efforts. So one of the questions we get asked a lot is, what is the city doing to protect our community, particularly up in the hills? So all of those agencies that I showed there on the first slide, whether it's Eugene Springfield Fire, other departments within the city of Eugene, we'll talk about public works and parks and open space. We partner a lot with the Bureau of Land Management, with the Oregon Department of Forestry. All of our agencies work to make sure we have a joint message around our education, that we're speaking the same language, the same terminology, we're providing the same information to our community to get that information out consistently and as frequently as we can. It's also important that we're always planning. Chief Heppel talked about the level of cooperation between agencies during the fire operational phase. That didn't happen overnight. That's years of working together, years of pre-planning, having those mutual aid agreements in place, working with emergency management, and practicing and drilling on those plans and knowing what we would do so we can put into place in the event of an emergency what we've practiced. So as government agencies, one of the things we take very seriously, and I'm going to give a huge shout out to our Public Works Department in Eugene, particularly our Parks and Open Space Division. They actually have a robust hazardous fuel treatment program for city-owned property. We think about our Ridgeline Trail and the Emerald Necklace of Eugene that runs along the ridgeline up there in the South Hills. And the city, in a lot of cooperation with Bureau of Land Management, who provides a lot of grant funding, have an aggressive plan where they are actively treating and creating fuel breaks along the ridgeline to protect from that top area and thinning out our tree stands, dealing with invasive species. And it's a multifaceted goal. It's not just about wildfire protection, though that is a part of it. We're also concerned about habitat restoration and conservation, protecting our watersheds. So there's a lot of aspects of that come together. And that's why it's so important that we work together as agencies and aren't doing our own thing in a silo. We had the opportunity to partner with a lot of those agencies last spring and are wrapping that project up here this fall, where we did a pilot, where we had some limited one-time funding, where we came together with Parks and Open Space, our urban forester, the Oregon Department of Forestry, the Northwest Youth Corps, and the fire department. And we're able to put on some educational seminars and target a neighborhood in Southeast Eugene to where we were able to provide some community chipping days and to provide some one-on-one consultations for neighbors up in that area, and then bring the youth corps crews in to actually do some of that fuel treatment to just get the process started. We have a program called Firewise that is an NFPA project. Oregon Department of Forestry is a huge supporter of that. And we do have a couple of Firewise communities in Lane County, and that's kind of a goal. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So education is the #1 component for how we get ahead of this situation. Education alone provides about a 35-to-1 return on investment. So the more that we can educate and people understand uh, the hazards that they're facing, the more proactive they can be on their own properties. If we all take a little piece of the bigger pie, we make a lot more progress than one person trying to do the whole piece. So we talk about hazardous fuels treatment. We use the term defensible space, and a targeted goal is to get about 150 feet around your home. And we'll talk about the various zones. And I want to put some minds at ease when we talk about that. One of the questions we always get asked is, you know, I moved into the trees because I love the trees. I want the privacy. I don't want to clear cut 150 feet around my home. That's not what we're talking about. So you're going to keep the trees. We're just going to make them look a little better, space them out a little bit. So we are absolutely not talking about clear cutting. So we create some fuel breaks. And as well as looking at those fuel breaks, particularly for emergency services, one of our main concerns is access and egress. We want to make sure in the event of an emergency that we can get to you and that you can get out. And so it's important to know your sources of information and listen to those as we direct and give information about which way you should go, which leaves other routes for us to get in. So we're always looking at that as well. And then as we look ahead, this is an area that as the fire marshal, I feel we still have some work to do in terms of, are there things we can put in place as we continue to grow farther and farther out into our wildland urban interface? As the city continues to grow, we're out into our urban growth boundary, we're looking 20, 30 years out. That's the direction that we're growing. What can we do to help make structures built in that area more resistant to wildfire? So can we be very strategic in the areas that we grow, making sure that we're planning for adequate means of access and egress? Can we look at things around codes and standards that can mandate some defensible space and some ignition resistant construction up front, right when they're built? We can't go back and mandate that for structures that are already built, but what can we do for things going forward? And some of those conversations are just beginning in some things that we can do, and technology has come a long ways. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit to what you can do. And I want to focus first on our little campfire analogies so we can talk about the different types of fuel. So it's very much like building a campfire. We got to start to get a good campfire with a little bit of tinder, some paper, something that's going to ignite quickly, get some heat going. Then you add a few sticks, get it growing a little bit bigger, build some heat, build some flame height, build some intensity so that we have enough energy to ignite those big logs that are going to sustain our campfire. So when we think of our fuel around our home, we can think sort of in those building blocks. Our dry grasses, our shrubbery, some of our bushes that are flammable, some of our understory, that's kind of our tinder. They burn very quick, they're easy to get going. Then we get into our limbs and our trees. We get those going, that helps build intensity, helps the fire get taller, gets hotter, gives us more radiant heat, and ultimately that can ignite a structure or our home as our logs. So we're going to look at interrupting that fuel chain in order to have some protection. So this is where we talk about that defensible space, and we break it into 3 zones. That first zone, zone 1, is from 0 to about 30 feet immediately around your home. That can really create a break in that fuel to keep the flame lengths lower, reduce the intensity, and help stop or slow, make it more resistant from actually igniting the structure. We'll talk a little bit about the structure itself in a few minutes, but for existing structures, the quickest, most effective way to make a difference is in defensible space, in creating those zones. So we're looking at making sure there's no combustible vegetation right up against the home. Getting some spacing, limbs aren't overhanging, we're cleaning up around the property. We'll show a few pictures of some kind of before and after, some good, not so good, to give you kind of an idea. But you can see even in the diagram, there's still trees, there's still vegetation, there's still shrubbery, there's some green grass. So again, just spreading it out, looking at some fire resistant planting as well. So being mindful of what we plant, controlling invasive species. And looking at our trees in particular, so we call this ladder fuels. So if we think of things on the ground, so if you think about some grass or a low-lying shrubbery kind of on the ground and it were to get to burning, and then it could catch these lower limbs of the tree on fire, and then that's going to let it climb right up the tree. Again, getting those higher intensities, those higher flame lengths, and gets up and gets to moving a lot quicker. So we can do some simple things. We can keep the tree, but just prune it up and limb it up and reduce those ladder fuels to keep the fire closer to the ground and not spreading so quickly. So here's a couple of pictures that are a little bit better examples. So you can see in the picture on the left how the shrubbery is kind of starting to get overgrown. It's really close to the house. If that were to get a fire going, it could easily spread to the house. Where in the picture on the right, still have some shrubbery, but it's broken up. It's separated from the house, has some green grass, so better. So some compare and contrast as we go through here a little bit. So then as we get farther and farther out from the house, then we're gonna have bigger, or usually our larger trees, more dense trees. So again, looking at that area is more about our forest health improvement. We want our trees to grow nice and healthy. And when they get really close together and dense, and I'm sure Tim will probably talk a lot more about the forest health aspect than I will, but thinning those out. So the trees that we do leave selectively get enough nutrients, enough sunlight, and can grow healthy and get rid of the dead stuff, the small stuff that's not able to grow to maturity, and clean out the dead snags. So one thing I want to note here as we get out into this zone 3 is your property may not be that large. When you're getting out into those outer circles, you may start overlapping with your neighbor's property. And this is where that community approach, that neighbors talking to neighbors, is how do we work together to, you're not doing all this work on your property, but your neighbor is not doing anything, and their picture is like the one on the left. We want to make sure that collectively we work together and can maximize the benefit from property to property and neighborhood to neighborhood. And that's how we get some fire-wise communities and create larger fuel breaks around those areas. So it's a good opportunity through your neighborhood groups, and it's a good opportunity to go next door and meet your neighbor and talk about how you can collaborate together for both of your benefits. Another thing we have a lot here in Oregon is some invasive species. We seem to be very fond of Scotch broom and blackberries. They grow prevalently in our community, and fire likes them. Fire burns very well in those invasive species. So it's something that we can also reduce our fire risk and return to some natural species and some natural habitat and some things that are more native to our area by thinning those out and changing that landscape a little bit. So looking at getting rid of some of those. You'll notice in some areas where Parks has done some work where they've been able to get rid of some of the Scotch broom and blackberries and have returned some of our beautiful prairies that are now blooming in some beautiful wildflowers in the summer, and doing a great job. So I'm talking just a little bit about the structure itself. This is certainly easier to do when you're building a new structure and thinking about these ignition resistant properties, but there are certainly some things you can do to existing homes as well. So the number one susceptible part of a structure to a wildfire is the roof. So it's the one thing, if you were to make one change to an existing structure, we would recommend making sure you have a non-combustible roof. And We occasionally still see wood shakes. Those can be quite flammable, especially over time as they age and wear. So thinking about asphalt shingles or tile or metal, and then making sure that your maintenance, making sure you keep the pine needles and the debris off the roof so that an ember doesn't get in there and begin to smolder and ignite. So typically when a home catches fire in a moving wildfire, it's from firebrands that are blowing and launching up to miles away from the main body of fire. So we want to look at places those firebrands can get, and that's where we want to focus our efforts. So again, they're going to land on the roof. Let's make sure we protect that. Looking at soffits and gutters and areas where there's vents along the foundation or in your soffit vents, to cover those with mesh screening so that debris cannot accumulate in there and a firebrand cannot penetrate. Thinking about combustible things, including fences, if they're attached to the structure. Looking at can we do something different to stop that fuel from connecting to the house. Fuel storage, firewood is another big one. In this picture, it kind of shows you here up under the deck. A good place to store things, keep them out of the weather. We're starting to get into the cold time of year. People don't want to walk too far out in the cold and the rain to get the firewood for their wood stoves or pellet stoves. But that is just a pile of fuel that can get going very intensely and very difficult to protect. Leaves, pine needles, things can get in the cracks and crevices of that stacked wood. If an ember gets in there, it's going to get going. And think about that campfire. We've got some intensity there that can easily spread to the structure. So keep those piles of firewood away from the structure. Combustible siding is another thing. Again, this one's usually easier dealt with at new construction, but if you're at a spot where you're doing some remodel and looking at re-siding, thinking about what type of material you're putting on the outside, looking at some hardy plank or concrete type lap siding versus wood shingle or vinyl siding that can melt very readily if exposed to heat. So just some things to think about as you're doing some home improvement, but the number one return on your investment will be that defensible space. So this is a graphic that's been around for a while, but just to give you an idea, I talked a little bit about that defensible space and roof construction, two very important factors. So if we look at our graph, we've got the lines down here at the bottom. Our arrows show 0 to 30 feet of defensible space, 30 to 80 feet, 80 to 100 feet, or 100 feet or more of defensible space. And then our back row of houses have wood roofs, and our front row of houses have fire resistant roofs. And you can see the percentage of homes that are destroyed by wildfire with those variables. So if you've got a good 30 to 80 feet of defensible space and a fire resistant roof, the chances of homes catching on fire is 5% as opposed to a home with a wood roof and 0 to 30 feet of defensible space is up to 60%. So things that can be done as you're starting to plan your spring cleaning. I know we've got to get through winter first, but it's a good time to start planning your spring cleaning projects for when the weather starts to turn a little bit nicer. And one step at a time, start with 0 to 5 feet, work on 30 feet, work on your next radius, things that you can do little by little to make those improvements. How do we coordinate to maximize the benefit? So engaging neighbors collectively. This is the part where it's awesome to have the neighborhood leaders council putting on this forum to where there's multiple neighborhood groups represented, and being able to work together within your groups, across groups, where you can leverage resources. You can look at other emergency planning to make sure that you're prepared in any event of an emergency, not just fire. We have ice storms prevalent. If we get an earthquake, a lot of the emergency preparedness principles will apply no matter what the emergency. Making sure that we have strong partnerships, just as government agencies, nonprofits, interest groups, us partnering with neighborhoods, and looking at how those work, encouraging everyone to get involved and how they can help individually and collectively, looking at the potential of fire-wise communities. And then as we continue to build a community wildfire protection plan that guides our future development, helps funding for fire-wise communities, and how we look at advocating for our strategic planning and development into those interface areas in the future. And so I'll leave you with a little Smokey Bear humor, and I'll hang around for any questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Chief Linder. That was very informative, and we look forward to working with you as we develop organization within our neighborhood. So thank you. I encourage you folks to ask questions. There's only a few of you who have asked them, so feel free.